Accounting, authentication, and authorization. Let's walk through accounting, authentication, and authorization concepts you'll need to recognize for the Security Plus exam. These three concepts are commonly grouped together as part of the AAA framework and are heavily tested in scenario-based questions. The key is understanding the order in which they occur and the purpose of each one. We'll begin with authentication, because this is always the first step. If a scenario describes verifying the identity of a user, device, or system, you are dealing with authentication. Authentication answers the question, who are you? A common trap is confusing authentication with authorization, but authentication happens first because the system must know who the user is before granting access. Authentication can involve something you know, something you have, or something you are. For example, when an employee enters a username and password to sign into a company laptop, the system checks whether those credentials match a valid account. That process is authentication because the system is verifying identity. Now let's move into authorization, because this is where permissions are determined. If the question describes deciding what resources or actions a user is allowed to access after logging in, that is authorization. Authorization answers the question, what are you allowed to do? A common confusion point is that users may successfully authenticate, but still be denied access to certain files or systems because they lack the proper permissions. For example, an employee may successfully log into a company network, but only managers are allowed to access payroll records. Even though the employee is authenticated, authorization controls determine whether they can open the payroll database. Now let's go deeper into monitoring and accountability. If a scenario describes tracking user activity, recording login times, logging accessed resources, or maintaining audit trails, you are dealing with accounting. Accounting focuses on recording what users do after they gain access to the system. A common trap is confusing accounting with authentication or authorization because all three are closely related. The easiest way to remember them is: authentication verifies identity. Authorization grants permissions. Accounting records activity. For example, after a network administrator logs into a router, the system may record every command entered, the login time, and the logout time. Those logs are part of accounting because they track user actions for auditing and investigations. Now let's connect these concepts into the AAA framework, because this is how the exam often presents them together. Authentication identifies the user. Authorization determines what the user can access. And accounting tracks what the user does. Technologies such as remote authentication dial-in user service, or RADIUS, commonly support all three of functions in enterprise environments. Now let's bring everything together using recognition patterns, because this is how you quickly identify the correct answer on the exam. If the question asks who the user is, think authentication. If it asks what the user is allowed to access, think authorization. If it asks what actions the user performed, think accounting. The most important takeaway is to recognize the sequence. First, identity is verified through authentication. Next, permissions are assigned through authorization. Finally, user actions are recorded through accounting. If you can recognize those distinctions and avoid the common confusion points between identity, permissions, and activity tracking, you'll be able to quickly eliminate incorrect answers and confidently select the correct concept on the exam.